Matariki is the Māori name for the star cluster Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters. Matariki is also the name for an international network of 7 universities that are distinguished by their historic traditions and unique approach to facing contemporary challenges. The Matariki Lecture Series offers a short program of lectures addressing current research themes or areas of common interest.
This time, the lecture series is on race, racism, and decolonization, with a specific focus on decolonization.
Thank you very much for the very generous introduction. I would like to also thank my colleagues who are also joining us this day, this night, this evening. Where currently by me it is 2 a.m. in the morning, but we don't see it in the background, so that is fine. Thank you all for being part of this initiative, the Matariki Lecture Series. It's so important to hear that we are not alone in the things that we're doing and fighting for as part of the decolonization project. Yes, as already said in my introduction, my name is Arhea Marshall. I'm a PhD candidate in Tübingen, Germany, southern Germany. And I am actually in the Department of English Studies doing post-colonial research. And today I'm going to be talking about educating about a point that I didn't add in the original topic, but I think it's important to identify racialization, racism, and its legacies from the colonial to post-colonial era across the Caribbean and Europe. And with this dichotomy between Caribbean and Europe, it also takes in that also Africa, North America, South America, also Asia and Oceania. So I would invite you to be generous with your imagination about how I'm using these terms. And as part of my beginning, I would like to start with unpacking some of these terms even. So here we go. So in my short talk, I'm going to be talking about the definitions of some of these terms as it relates to post-colonial history, the Caribbean and Europe defining these spaces, and also looking at education as a decolonization project. Part of my PhD, as already mentioned, is looking at Calypso, Trinidadian Calypso, as an archive that has not been looked at in looking at the post-colonial Caribbean and also world history, looking at sung archives, oral archives, that as part of my research, I'm actually doing transcriptions that they'll also be available as text. So for maybe to begin, we need to look at, when we get to that slide yet, we want to unpack the historical developments and context. And I want to directly connect to Dr. Adams' point about understanding context and legacies. I think it's important that it's understood, but it's also important that we teach it. And that's where it actually comes into play in the way that I'm thinking about the way I want to be an academic when I'm finished my PhD and going towards looking towards professorship, is looking at how do we teach the legacies and contexts that are difficult, that have been one-sidedly taught, single stories in some instances. And how do we bring that close to generations that in some instances have only been taught the one-sided history? And understanding that this history that needs to be unpacked should not be for the distinguished few in academia, but also at the primary, secondary school level. I also like to directly connect what Dr. Mariah said about these intertwined fortunes and futures. We need to understand that they have been intertwined. If you look at the Caribbean, for example, we're really looking at a space in which you say the development into world history has been intertwined with what has happened in other continents, what's been decided in other continents. And even up until today, even when we're talking about it as a post-colonial space, is very much dependent on the global context. And thank you once again, Dr. Adams, for also mentioning this global-local dichotomy that's very artificial, that's very much present also when you talk about post-colonial studies, because we're talking about post-colonial societies, and usually we're talking about societies in which colonial rule was exercised and not thinking about the colonial societies in which definitions occurred. And it's important to look at both sides as post-colonial societies. And that's why I want to look towards Europe as well. I mean, also positioning myself as a Caribbean scholar. I was born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago, had my tertiary education in the United States and here in Germany, but looking also at this definition of Europe, what does it incur historically? What types of legacies does it incur in the spaces that I belong to as an individual, but also important for the history and unpacking of it and relevance also for the learners in the context that I have. And of course, looking at beyond colonial encounters. This is an important part of looking at racialization and racism, because when you look towards the Caribbean and you're looking beyond the pre-colonial encounters that were there, that we only have the archaeological record and DNA history really to give us an idea of what was there, we could actually see that the start of what actually is known about world history in the Caribbean are colonial encounters. And that actually first changed with Haiti being the first Black republic. But that didn't really see the continued wave in the Caribbean as a whole. I'm talking about the Caribbean, not just the Anglophone Caribbean, not just the Hispanophone Caribbean, but the Caribbean geographically defined, also coastal Caribbean. We actually see that beyond colonial encounters leads us to post-independence. And when we're talking about post-independence, we're not talking about only sovereign states, because then we wouldn't be talking about the Caribbean as a whole anymore. There are non-sovereign states still in the Caribbean, and understanding this is a part of legacy and fortune that's still going on. But that brings us to the question of what is the role of decolonization? Because that's the reason we're all sitting here today, to have this discussion. And I would like to borrow Shannon Moreira from the University of Cape Town's definition that decolonization as an extension is a hard term to define really as relates to knowledge and curricula. But one core idea that's emerged is that different kinds of knowledge need to be valued. And the archive, the Jagger archive in this instance, that at the beginning of last year, unfortunately caught flame, and they're still doing a lot of reparation work in terms of how to salvage the knowledge of African knowledge that was there, but also global knowledge from the African perspective, and analyzing how these knowledge stores can be historically undervalued and how we need to go forward historically looking towards the future to value them. How do we value what has historically and continually, unfortunately, been undervalued? And I'd like to present to you basically what my curriculum has been in the last 2 semesters here at the University of Tübingen. I've had the opportunity to work in our over-departmental courses, part of our former career services, and look at how teaching a wide range of students from different fields. I've had neuroscientists, people who are in Latin American studies, of course, or English and American studies, to people who are doing German studies, who have been interested in the question of, okay, what does the Caribbean have to play in a role in my studies? And that's been very interesting to light. So to summarize, education as a decolonization project is intrinsic to the process, was intrinsic to the process of racialization and racism, and even currently to the process of racialization and racism that we see, for example, in global health that we heard before, or even historically on university campuses globally. And therefore, education needs to be essential for decolonization. We need to educate on what happened colonially, but also what on legacies on racialization and racism that are in our fields today. And that is one of the things that I address in my course. One of the things that I like to present when I do my courses is actual primary sources. As you can see on my slide, I do a lot of archive work when I go back to the Caribbean and try to really show students here that their newspapers, it's giving this basic understanding that there is a commonality across culture, and what these newspapers, for example, define also culturally, historically. Here you see the Independence newspaper of Trinidad and Tobago, issued on August 31st, 1962, and also looking at symbology. As I mentioned, I study basically Calypso, but also looking at how different media really represent each other and are replayed in each other. For example, the national motto of Trinidad and Tobago, discipline, production, and tolerance, is something that isn't just written here, but it's sung constantly. It's something that's hoisted on the flags. You see the Union Jack in this picture. One of the lyrics that constantly come up is the Union Jack went down and the Trinidadian colors got hoisted up. So this kind of played together. Also looking at colonialism and post-colonialism, looking at history as a set of narratives, archives, memory, commemoration that is either brought into the space or left out of the space. Also looking at different identities that are underrepresented, for example, the Jewish presence in the Caribbean, on Trinidad and Tobago especially, and before the Ashkenazi presence. So looking at Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish identity, and also looking at the way culture through food is very important, and not in a it's also important when we talk about culture as a representation of food that it's not re-colonialized in that way, but understanding how colonial identity, as I mentioned at the beginning, was something that was mirrored across culture. So it wasn't just the colonial identity of Trinidad and Tobago to identify itself as an English cuisine, but to understand that British cuisine today takes very many elements from Caribbean cuisine, and understanding how that represents one identity born out of very difficult fortune. When I do my courses, I usually keep them short and keep them very much oriented towards the learner. So here you see one of the examples of how I teach my courses. And the first day I give the course objectives and try to position the learners into what it means to be in global awareness. For example, last semester I taught soundtracks to the post-colonial movements in the Caribbean, looking at the Caribbean space beyond reggae, for example, or beyond the few artist names that people know or as a vacation space, looking at the topics of colonialism, looking at them historically. What does that mean? What does colonialism actually mean in this space? I also think it's important when we talk about decolonization that we talk about what specific iterations of colonialization that happened. I know that the final talk in our series today is going to be talking about settler colonization, but how that is just as one iteration of many different forms that were exercised. Looking also at the north-south, global south divides, also an artificial divide, but how it helps us in terms of thinking about inequalities throughout spaces historically, talking about also the difficulty in defining a space singularly, the Caribbean, especially something that I wrestle with, or the idea of Europe. This is something I always ask students to reflect in this course as well, and looking at the Caribbean as a space or model to kind of rethink some of the norms that have been propagated in Western hegemonic academia. And then going through what it means independence in terms of movements and soundtracks, talking about different academic works that have actually looked at the song lyrics as a form of literature, going into a group work phase where also it's important to come into discussion. It shouldn't just be a lecture in which I download all of my knowledge, because as someone who has lived experience, it's important for me that students also have a lived experience with the knowledge that they're coming into contact with. And it's been very productive to do this kind of work, giving you an idea of how simple it actually can be. I myself would consider myself through time now a historian in the Caribbean, but I wouldn't consider myself just a historian in terms of global history, but Caribbean history in this kind of aspect. That was my short presentation on how I educate decolonization, basically. And I'm looking forward to the questions you may have towards the end. Thank you very much.